Okay, everybody, this is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium for Thursday, August 30th, in the year of the apocalypse 2012. And speaking of apocalypse, that's what we'll be talking about in today's little video blog. I do want to thank everybody that has been making donations, signing up for memberships on the website. It's been keeping me really busy. And I wanted to alert everybody about a little problem that may be going on the website. If you are having any problems, check your PayPal account. A number of you, quite a number of you, we've noticed have been having PayPal payments skipped, and we think it's a problem on PayPal's end. But you might want to check things out and make sure that you're all current. And I want to thank everybody that sends me articles, and in particular, this one that I'm going to be talking about today was sent to me by a number of you. My usual routine is when I get up, I start surfing around online for internet articles to blog about and talk about that kind of interest me, and I found this one. Then I checked my email, and a lot of you had sent me this one as well. This is from Boiling Frog Post, and I'll put the link up. And the title of the article is Barbarians at the Gate: Terrorism, the U.S., and the Subversion of Russia. And as you'll know, this has been a problem and a major concern of mine ever since I started watching the financial situation that's unfolding and also the geopolitical situation, particularly with respect to Russia, to China, the so-called BRICS nations. Now, recently we've had the shootings and bombings in Ingushetia and Dagestan, all right, former Soviet republics in the Caucasus region that is between Russia and Turkey, and also, of course, in that strategic region between Russia and Iran. So obviously this is a region of geopolitical concern to the West, because if Russia is to make good on its promises of backing to Iran, it has to have access. Now, of course, there's the Caspian Sea, which essentially is a Russian lake, but there's also that overland route to Iran through the Caucasus. Now, formerly, that gave the Soviet Union instant access. Now, with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the rise of all those little republics in the Caucasus region, it's become something of an unstable region. Well, I want to read parts of this article because they're very interesting, and then I want to give you a bit of historical perspective that goes back even farther than this article goes, all right? And I think you'll find this perspective rather interesting because it forms a small component of the research I'm doing now for the new book, Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations. And incidentally, folks, just to bring you up to date on that, there is what I've written on Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, which I finally started writing this week. So I've been busy. I'm kind of exhausted because I've done about 3 chapters in 3 days, which is beyond my normal pace of writing. So, but I've got to get this book done. Anyway, here's the article, and I'll read the portions I have highlighted to you. Quote, the attacks in Gushetia and Dagestan are not simply isolated terrorist actions, but rather cynically orchestrated events carried out by well-connected criminal networks, meaning inside of the former Soviet republics, whose goal is to foment conflict and carry out the agenda of the U.S. intelligence establishment in its subversion of Russia. Skipping a little bit now. Within hours of the deadly attacks, the Kavkaz Center, an organization known to be propaganda mouthpiece of terrorist leader Doku Umarov, released an article characterizing the attacks as heroic acts and referring to the dead as Russian puppets. Though this would seem to be not in keeping with the center's stated mission to provide reporting of events and assistance of journalistic work in the Caucasus, this is, in fact, very much par for the course for an organization that is funded by the U.S. State Department and Finland's Foreign Ministry. Kavkaz Center has a long track record of supporting and legitimizing terrorist actions throughout the region, rationalizing atrocities committed in the name of quote-unquote resistance. In fact, Kavkaz engages in perpetual upside-down logic, referring to Russians as terrorists and terrorists as heroes. This type of Goebbels-esque propaganda is the hallmark of Western imperialist projects, most recently in the conflict in Syria. And skipping a little further in the article. Their activity alone is not altogether significant if seen in a vacuum, but rather it is the association of these types of individuals and organizations with the U.S. State Department and U.S. intelligence that makes them particularly insidious. One such entity that bears scrutiny is the American Committee for Peace in the Caucasus, previously known as the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya. As reported by Wright Webb at the Institute for Policy Studies, the ACPC was founded in 1999 by Freedom House, a neoconservative organization that has worked closely with the U.S. government, receiving funds from the National Endowment for Democracy and other U.S. democratization initiatives, unquote. Now, I want to draw your attention to that National Endowment for Democracy, because this is a key front piece for U.S. intelligence operations, particularly those kinds of operations that have been behind fomenting the so-called color revolutions, not only in the former Soviet republics, particularly the Ukraine, but also elsewhere in the world. This is the front piece, and this is the game plan, which is to say the game plan is to foment these types of quote-unquote spontaneous uprisings and to, so to speak, weaponize human rights against governments that the West, particularly the United States, deems unsuitable, and to use these movements to place into power in those places governments deemed to be suitable to the West and its geopolitical agenda. So that's an entity for you all to watch, the National Endowment for Democracy. But now you'll notice that what this article is saying is that this whole enterprise, this whole methodology, is now being directed directly against Russia. And I want to comment about that a little bit, but I want to continue with the final few quotations from this article. Quote, "The paternalistic role of the U.S. intelligence establishment in the ACPC is made all the more evident when one examines some of the more well-known members, including former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, former Pentagon Advisor Richard Perle, and other top neocons such as William Crystal, Elliot Abrams, Kenneth Edelman, and Robert Kagan, the last two being closely associated with the inner circle of the Romney campaign. What becomes apparent, even in a cursory analysis of these figures, is that despite the preponderance of neoconservatives, the top members of the ACPC are pulled from both the liberal and conservative establishments. Therefore, one can see how the ACPC represents a bipartisan consensus within the U.S. imperialist ruling class, a consensus of aggression against Russia." Now, way towards the end of the article, I'm going to cite two more things before I make any comment. The seemingly endless attempts to subvert the Putin government are cynically designed operations whose overarching goal is geopolitical in nature. To the U.S. and its allies, partners, and clients, Putin represents a bloc that is difficult, if not impossible, to maneuver around. As demonstrated clearly in Syria, President Putin is able to successfully lead an opposition to the United States, an empire attempting to impose its hegemonic designs on the world. He has successfully established the legitimacy of international institutions, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, that exist outside of the dominance of the United States and have begun to emerge as a counterweight to NATO and other similar arms of U.S. imperialism. Close quote. Now, let me comment on all of that. What is going on right now with these moves, I think, has begun probably about 2 years ago, perhaps a little longer, but I think it's been given new impetus most recently in recent months. And that is a slight shift in the geopolitics and the strategy that is now being played out. Whereas before, I think you could argue the case that the principal focus of attention was on the Middle East and therefore on Iran and Afghanistan, Pakistan, that whole Central Asian heartland, whose resources it was the goal of the Western elite to dominate, all right, especially in the wake of the crack-up of the Soviet Union, when many of those Central Asian Soviet republics became, so to speak, free and therefore able to be dominated by the West, which has already put American military bases in some of them, all right? Now, I think what we see going on, and I've commented before on why Putin is an obstacle, and many of my friends in Russia don't get what I'm saying. I am not saying that Putin's a nice man. I'm not saying that he's not connected to the KGB. I'm not saying that there isn't even an oligarchy behind him. I am saying that Putin is a Russian nationalist, and most probably a kind of throwback to the type of nationalist that you saw in the late Tsarist period, rather than the kind that you saw under the communist regime. And I'm not going to try here in this short amount of time to make that case. It can be made, although it requires a great deal of background information about Russian history as to why it could be made. In any case, Putin represents an obstacle, an opposition to this unipolar world that others in the West would like to see emerge. And therefore, I think the geopolitical game has now shifted. I think that we're seeing the first beginnings of an attempt by the West to destabilize Russia directly and to reimpose in Russia a regime, much like the Yeltsin regime was, that is much, much more amenable and favorable to Western oligarchical and financial interests than the Putin regime currently. Now, I think that this may backfire because as the West steps up this activity, the sad reaction on the part of the Russian elite is going to be much more authoritarianism of this new kind of Putin-esque character, all right? If the West relents from that effort, you might see a more genuine flourishing within Russia of genuine democratic elements. But make no mistake, those elements in Russia using this very, very young Russian democracy are using the opposition parties to Putin, and that means that those opposition parties are co-opted by the West. All right, this is the sad reality of the situation we're in. Now, what is really going on here, I think, in the long term, is something that goes back to World War II and, once again, to the Nazis. All right, and I want to bring to your attention a book. I actually have had this book for a while, but a number of you have pointed it out to me. So I want to reassure you that I have the book. It's called Gladio, NATO's Dagger at the Heart of Europe, the Pentagon Nazi Mafia Terror Axis, and the author's name is down here, Richard Cottrell. All right. Now, what Cottrell points out is that circa the late 1950s, early 1960s, the NATO command came to a very interesting conclusion, and one that it did not widely publicize, because had it done so, the whole Cold War rationale and logic would have collapsed. And the conclusion it came to was basically that there was no need for a continuation of its stay-behind units. Now, what that means, and I'll tell you what the stay-behind units are in a minute, but what that means is that the NATO command had concluded that there was no imminent military threat from the Warsaw Pact of invasion, and hence the rationale for the stay-behind units had completely evaporated. And so what the NATO command then proceeded to do was redefine the mission role of those stay-behind units to be domestic in nature. In other words, internal to the member nations of the NATO organization. Now, what are these stay-behind units? They're called the Gladio units, all right? And they were units that were specially trained, military units specially trained, that would stay behind enemy lines in the event of a Warsaw Pact invasion of Europe, and then wage a kind of all-out guerrilla warfare against the rear echelon areas of the Warsaw Pact forces. All right. Now, this whole idea of stay-behind units as a means of undermining the Russian and Eastern European military bloc, with eventually the goal of rolling it back. That is a key concept. The eventual goal was to roll back the Russian Empire back into Russia itself, and eventually, in some cases, to topple it. So these stay-behind units actually were the brainchild, guess who, of General Reinhard Gehlen and Fremde Heer Ost during World War II, when his whole organization literally stayed behind as the Russians rolled into Central Europe, stayed behind Russian lines and formed the nucleus, the basis of the human on-the-ground intelligence networks of the West inside of the Soviet Union and later, of course, the Warsaw Pact. Now, this isn't to say that that organization was not deeply and badly penetrated by Russian intelligence. It was, all right? But like any penetration, it's never complete, it's never 100%. So in other words, this represented a significant interior problem for the Soviet Union. These are the units, this is the background behind the current effort, I believe, to use these so-called spontaneous uprisings in Europe, in the former Soviet republics, because you cannot have uprisings like that without organization. And that implies that there's a unit behind these things. That implies there's financing behind it. That implies that there's a great power intelligence network behind what's going on. So the game plan really hasn't changed, folks. It's just now, in my opinion, that the target may be shifting subtly from the Middle East, from Syria and Iran, to Russia. After all, the West cannot impose what it wants to do in Syria or Iran so long as they have major power backing in the form of Russia and China. So now the geopolitical game, I think, is going to change subtly over the next few years, and you're going to see Russia reemerge once again as the central target of Western propaganda, geopolitics, subversion activities, and so on. Anyway, I'm a little over time, folks. I want to thank you for paying attention to this news and views, and we'll see everybody on the flip side. Bye-bye, and God bless.